counting the cost. That was the theme for Missio
Yes.
Nexus, and this last week, the Missio Nexus conference, and I just like to know. I mean, Missio Nexus got to hear Mary Ho speak Wednesday night, and for those who don't know, the director of All Nations, the group that sent John Allen Chau to the Sentinel Islands, and who was killed, and Ed Stetzer wrote an article in the Washington Post in response to that. And I'd like to get your comments. Obviously the end of the Spear story is near and dear to ITEC. And in 1956, when Nate Saint and Jim Elliott and those guys died, it fueled people to go on the field. And Steve Saint wrote an article after John Allen Chau died called "Must We Obey?" and just responding to just where we're at in our evangelical culture in 2018 when John Allen Chau died versus in 1956. And in 2018, people are asking, well, should we be doing this?
Yes.
And so I just like to get your perspective. You're the leader of a set. You make decisions. You send people into some dangerous places, and so just your perspective as a missions leader, but also just the trends that you're seeing in the response of our culture in 1956 versus in 2018.
Yeah, exactly. So in 1956, was it Life magazine that had the spread and the title? Was it "Go Preach the Gospel, 5 Do and Die"?
Some do and
Something
die,
along
right?
that
Yeah,
line.
5 do and die.
And what a contrast in the society at large with respect to their attitude toward Christians and toward even missions at that time compared to what it was just a few years ago, where it was highly critical. And so this really, the whole thing about missions being harmful. But as far as we're concerned with the church here in the West, my observation is we're becoming more and more safety conscious. I mean, it's an epidemic. And it's almost become one of our idols, if I could be bold enough to say that. And it's something we need to wrestle with. I think a lot of people would do things except for the legal environment in which we live, which is another major constraint of organizations. And we try to push the boundaries. And we have people in some very unexpected places around the world, obviously in security sensitive locations. So we're doing that. But I think this is another reason we need to be partnering globally, because there are fellow believers from other countries who aren't under the same constraints or inhibitions culturally and legally. And they can be going into these places, and we can be helping them and providing some of the support things. So yeah, it's a real shame, but it's part of the world we're living in today. So it's happening both outside the church and it's seeping in major ways even within the church. My parents carrying me in when I was 6 months old, and landing on the shore there of the river with 400 fully armed headhunters waiting to welcome us. I mean, what self-respecting mission agency would allow that to happen today? Times have changed.
But I am encouraged by your story of your parents' willingness to,
yes,
and I think about even like, our, Abraham Lincoln writing the letter to Mrs. Bixby, and he tells when her sons died in the Revolution, in the Civil War, and says, he talked about the solemn pride that must be yours to have laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom, and I just see where we're at, in our culture, just moving away from, and so I do want to see us get, it's as a church culture where we value that, we value sacrifice, we have to counter the, and I don't know exactly what you say in your book, but I would like, what would you say to where we get back? Dick Brogdon spoke last week at Missio Nexus. A lot of those things you're talking about taking risk and how risk averse we've become. So what would you say I mean, you deal with young, you mobilize people. What would you say to parents? I mean, you've obviously had the Beckett, is that her name, Beckett?
Yeah, Cheryl.
You have a building named after a young, relatively recently killed in Afghanistan. So what would you say? Maybe it's a two-part question. What would you say to parents, safety conscious parents, and what would you say needs to happen in order for us to get back to a place where we really value sacrifice, and we make that something that we, even like when Paul says, honor men like him, Epaphroditus, who nearly died for the sake of the gospel. How do we create that culture within the church? Again, if may have been, maybe again isn't always the right word, but how do we get that?
Yeah, rediscover the privilege of suffering for the gospel. As Paul said, I think we have a hard time relating to some of the statements that Paul and others make about the value in heaven's economy of this short window of opportunity that we have to actually sacrifice and suffer. To parents, that's a hard one, because I can only imagine the sorts of concerns that go through our minds as parents and grandparents even. But I would say this, that biblically, entrusting our loved ones into God's hands is a completely responsible thing to do.
Yes.
And there's nothing that can eventuate that escapes the filter of God's grace and sovereign control. And I think we sometimes live under the illusion that we're safer here at home, driving our streets, than we are serving in some foreign country. As far as the church at large, I'm sure there's quite a few different angles in the answer to your question, but one to me is, I think a key is the pastors and leadership of our churches. And this applies not just to our theology of suffering, and including that as a regular part of the menu in our church services and our teaching, but to missions in general in a broader sense. There's nothing more powerful than having leadership, senior leadership in a church, in a congregation, elders and pastors who have a heart for the Great Commission and for God's glory among the nations. And I even suggest that the churches write into the job description of their lead pastor, visiting the mission field, to some unreached context, at least every 2 years. And over time, that'll help change the culture of their teaching, and that applies to suffering as well. But, I have this other book idea. I've got a few other book ideas. And one of them, John, I think you're referring to, is blind spots in the Western evangelical church. And I think the theology of suffering is one of those. And we need to start spending more time contemplating that blind spot.